Well, hello again, guys. Going to continue with Parnassus on Wheels, smoking my Peterson African Meerschaum with some Rattray's Marlin Flake. Chapter 7. Now, if you remember back to Chapter 6, Andrew had just caught up with them on the road. Andrew is just as thin as I am fat, and his clothes hang on him in the most comical way. He is very tall and shambling, and wears a ragged beard and a broad Stetson hat, and suffers amazingly from hay fever in the autumn. In fact, his essay on hay fever is the best thing he ever wrote, I think. As he came striding up the road, I noticed how his trousers fluttered at the ankles as the wind plucked at them. The breeze curled his beard back under his chin, and his face was quite dark with anger. I couldn't help but being amused. He looked so funny. The sage looks like Bernard Shaw, whispered Mifflin. I always believe in drawing first blood. Good morning, Andrew, I called cheerfully. Want to buy any books? I halted Pegasus, and Andrew stood a little in front of the wheel, partly out of breath and mostly out of temper. What on earth is this nonsense, Helen? He said angrily. You've led me the deuce of a chase since yesterday. And who is this person you're driving with? Andrew, I said, you've forgotten your manners. Let me introduce Mr. Mifflin. I have bought his caravan, and I'm taking a holiday selling books. Mr. Mifflin is on his way to Port Figure, where he takes the train to Brooklyn. Andrew stared at the professor without speaking. I could tell by the blaze in his light blue eyes that he was thoroughly angry, and I feared things would be worse before they were better. Andrew was slow to wrath, but a very hard person to deal with when he's roused. And I had some inkling by this time of the professor's temperament. Moreover, I'm afraid that some of my remarks had rather prejudiced him against Andrew, as a brother at any rate, and apart from his excellent prose. Mifflin had the next word. He had taken off his funny little cap, and his bare skull shone like an egg. I noticed a little sort of fairy ring of tiny drops around his crown. My dear sir, said Mifflin, the proceedings look somewhat unusual, but the facts are simple to narrate. Your sister has bought this van and its contents, and I have been instructing her in my theories of the dissemination of good books. You, as a literary man... Andrew paid absolutely no attention to the professor, and I saw a slow flush tinge Mifflin's sallow cheek. Look here, Helen, said Andrew. Do you think I propose to have my sister careering around the state with a strolling vagabond? Upon my soul, you ought to have better sense, and at your age and weight. I got home yesterday and found your ridiculous note. I went to Mrs. Collins, and she knew nothing. I went to Mason's and found him wondering who had bilked his telephone. I suppose you did that. He had seen this freight car of yours and put me on the track, but my God, I never thought to see a woman of 40 abducted by gypsies. I gotta relight my pipe. Let me set that down for a second. With my fancy pink lighter. Mifflin was about to speak, but I waved him back. Now see here, Andrew, I said. You talk too quickly. A woman of 40, you exaggerate, by the way, who has compiled an anthology of 6,000 loaves of bread and dedicated to you, deserves some courtesy. When you want to run off on some vagabond tour or other, you don't hesitate to do it. You expect me to stay home and do the lady egalitine in the poultry yard. By the ghost of Susan B. Anthony, I won't do it. This is the first real holiday I've had in 15 years, and I'm going to suit myself. Andrew's mouth opened, but I shook my fist so convincingly that he halted. I bought this Parnassus from Mr. Mifflin fair and square for $400. That's the price of about 1,300 dozen eggs. I said, and I had worked this out in my head while Mifflin was talking about his book, the money's mine and I'm going to use it my own way. Now, Andrew McGill, if you want to buy any books, you can parley with me. Otherwise, I'm on my way. You can expect me back when you see me. I handed him one of Mifflin's little cards, which were in a pocket at the side of the van, and gathered up the reins. I was really angry, for Andrew had been both unreasonable and insulting. Boy, I can't keep this going. Andrew looked at the card and tore it in halves. He looked at the side of Parnassus where the fresh red lettering was still damp. Well, upon my word, he said, you must be crazy. He burst into a violent fit of sneezing, a last touch of hay fever, I suspect, as there are still goldenrod in the meadows. He coughed and sneezed furiously, which made him madder than ever. At last he turned to Mifflin, who was sitting bald-headed with a flushed face and very bright eyes. Andrew took him all in. The shabby Norfolk jacket, the bulging memorandum pocket book in his pocket, the stuffed portmanteau under his foot, even the copy of Happiness and Hayseed, which had dropped to the floor and lay back up. Look here, you, said Andrew. I don't know by what infernal arts you cajoled my sister away to go vagabonding in a huckster's wagon, but I know this, that if you've cheated her out of her money, I'll have the law on you. I tried to insert a word of protest, but matters had gone too far. The professor was as mad as Andrew now. By the bones of Piers Plowman, he said, I had expected to meet a man of letters and the author of this book. He held up Happiness and Hayseed. But I see I was mistaken. I tell you, sir, a man who would insult his sister before a stranger as you have done is an oaf and a cad. He threw the book over the hedge, and before I could say a word, he had vaulted over the wheel and ran round behind the van. Look here, he said, with his little red beard bristling. Your sister is over age and acting of her own free will. By the bones of the Baptist, I don't blame her for wanting a vacation if this is the way you treat her. She is nothing to me, sir, and I am nothing to her. But I propose to be a teacher to you. Put up your hands and I'll give you a lesson. This was too much for me. I believe I screamed aloud and started to clamber from the van. But before I could do anything, the two fanatics had begun to pummel each other. I saw Andrew swing savagely at Mifflin, and Mifflin hit him square on the chin. Andrew's hat fell on the road. Peg stood placidly, and Bach made as if to grab Andrew's leg, but I hopped out and seized him. It was certainly a weird sight. I suppose I should have wrung my hands and had hysterics, but as a matter of fact, I was almost amused. It was so silly. Thank goodness the road was deserted. Andrew was a foot taller than Professor, but awkward, loosely knit, and unmuscular, while the little Redbeard was wiry as a cat. Also, Andrew was so furious that he was quite beside himself, and Mifflin was in the cold anger that always wins. Andrew landed a couple of flailing blows on the other man's chest and shoulders, but in 30 seconds he got another punch on the chin followed by one on the nose that tumbled him over backwards. Andrew sat in the road fishing for a handkerchief, and Mifflin stood glaring at him, but looking very ill at ease. Neither of them said a word. Bach broke away from me and capered and danced about Mifflin's feet as if it were all a game. It was an extraordinary scene. Andrew got up, mopping his bleeding nose. Upon my soul, he said, I almost respect you for that punch. But by Jove, I'll have the law on you for kidnapping my sister. You're a fine kind of pirate. Mifflin said nothing. Don't be a fool, Andrew, I said. Can't you see that I want a little adventure of my own? Go home and bake 6,000 loaves of bread, and by the time they're done, I'll be back again. I think 2 men of your age ought to be ashamed of yourselves. I'm going off to sell books. And with that, I climbed up to the seat and clucked to Pegasus. Andrew and Mifflin and Bach remained standing in the road. I was mad all the way through. I was mad at both men for behaving like schoolboys. I was mad at Andrew for being so unreasonable, yet in a way I admired him for it. I was mad at Mifflin for giving Andrew a bloody nose, and yet I appreciated the spirit in which it was done. I was mad at myself for causing all the trouble, and I was mad at Parnassus. If there had been a convenient cliff handy, I would have pushed the old thing over it. But now I was in for it, and just had to go on. Slowly, I rolled up a long grade, and then saw Port Vigor lying ahead in the broad blue stretches of the Sound. Okay, I gotta relight again. I wish I could hold up the book and relight and still read. Of course, this marlin flake is pretty wet. Maybe the wrong tobacco for a long read. Parnassus rumbled on with a pleasant creak, and the mellow sun and the sweep of the air soon soothed me. I began to taste salt in the wind, and above the meadows 2 or 3 seagulls were circling. Like all women, my angry mood melted into a reaction of exaggerated tenderness, and I began to praise both Andrew and Mifflin in my heart. How fine to have a brother so solicitous of his sister's welfare and reputation, and yet how splendid the little scrawny professor had been. How quick to resent an insult, and how bold to avenge it. His absurd little tweed cap was lying on the seat, and I picked it up almost sentimentally. The lining was frayed and torn. From my suitcase in the van, I got out a small sewing kit, and hanging the reins on a hook, I began to stitch up the rents as Peg jogged along. I thought with amusement of the quaint life Mr. Mifflin had led in his caravan of culture. I imagined him addressing the audience of Whitman disciples at Camden and wondering how the fuss ended. I imagined him in his beloved Brooklyn, strolling in Prospect Park and preaching to chance comers his gospel of good books. How different was his militant love of literature from Andrew's quiet satisfaction. Yet how much they really had in common. It tickled me to think of Mifflin reading aloud from Happiness and Hayseed and praising it so highly just before fighting with the author and giving him a bloody nose. I remembered that I should have spoken to Andrew about feeding the hens and reminded him of his winter undergarments, but helpless creatures men are, after all. See, it's going out again. I finished mending the cap in high good humor. I had hardly laid it down when I heard a quick step in the road behind me, and looking back, there was Mifflin, striding along with his bald pate covered with little beads of moisture. Bach trotted sedately at his heels. I halted Peg. Well, I said, what happened to Andrew? Time to relight again. Wrong tobacco for eating. Too moist. But I do love it. The professor still looked a bit sham-faced. The sage is a tenacious person, he said. We argued for a bit without much satisfaction. As a matter of fact, we nearly came to blows again. Only he got another waft of goldenrod, which started him sneezing, and then his nose began bleeding once more. He's convinced that I'm a ruffian and said so in excellent prose. Honestly, I admire him a great deal. I believe he intends to have the law on me. I gave him my Brooklyn address in case he wants to follow the matter up. I think I rather pleased him by asking him to autograph Happiness and Hayseed for me. I found it lying in the ditch. Well, I said, you two are certainly a great pair of lunatics. You both ought to go on the stage. You'd be as good as Weber and Fields. Did he give you the autograph? He pulled the book out of his pocket. Scrawled in pencil were the words, I have shed blood for Mr. Mifflin, Andrew McGill. I shall read the book again with renewed interest, said Mifflin. May I get in? By all means, I said. There's Port Vigor in front of us. He put on his cap, noticed that it seemed to feel different, pulled it off again, then looked at me in quaint embarrassment. You are very good, Miss McGill, he said. Where did Andrew go, I asked. He set off for Shelby on foot, Mifflin answered. He has a grand stride for walking. He suddenly remembered that he left some potatoes boiling on the fire yesterday afternoon and said he must get back to attend to them. He said he hoped you would send him a postal card now and then. Do you know, he reminds me of Thoreau more than ever. He reminds me of a burnt cooking pot, I said. I suppose all my kitchenware will be in a horrible state when I get home. The end of chapter 7. I think I'll set the pipe down. Read chapter 8. Knock 2 of them out. Port Vigor is a fascinating old town. It is built on a point jutting out into the Sound. Dimly in the distance, one can see the end of Long Island, which Mifflin viewed with sparkling eyes. It seemed to bring him closer to Brooklyn. Several schooners were beating along the estuary in the fresh wind, and there was a delicious tang of brine in the air. We drove direct to the station where the professor alighted. He took his portmanteau and shut Bach inside the van to prevent the dog from following him. Then there was an awkward pause as he stood by the wheel with his cap off. Well, Miss McGill, he said, there's an express train at 5 o'clock, so with luck I shall be in Brooklyn tonight. My brother's address is 600 Abingdon Avenue. I hope when you're sending a card to the Sage you'll let me have one too. I shall be very homesick for Parnassus, but I'd rather leave her with you than with anyone I know. He bowed very low, and before I could say a word, he blew his nose violently and hurried away. I saw him carrying his valise into the station, and then he disappeared. I suppose that living alone with Andrew for all those years has unused me to the eccentricities of other people. But surely this little Redbeard was one of the strangest beings one would be likely to meet. Bach yowled dismally inside, and I did not feel in any mood to sell books in Port Vigor. I drove back into the town and stopped at a tea shop for a pot of tea and some toast. When I came out, I found that quite a little crowd had collected, partly owing to the strange appearance of Parnassus, and partly because of Bach's plaintive cries from within. Most of the onlookers seemed to suspect the outfit of being part of a traveling menagerie, so almost against my will I put up the flaps, tied Bach to the tail of the wagon, and began to answer the humorous questions of the crowd. 2 or 3 bought books without any urging. It was some time before I could get away. Finally, I shut up the van and pulled off, as I was afraid of seeing someone I knew. As I turned into the Woodbridge Road, and I heard the whistle of the 5 o'clock train to New York. The 20 miles of road between Sabine Farm and Port Vigor was all familiar to me, but now to my relief I struck into a region that I had never visited. On my occasional trips to Boston, I had always taken the train to Port Vigor, so the country roads were unknown. But I had set out on the Woodbridge way because Mifflin had spoken of a farmer. Mr. Pratt lived about 4 miles out of Port Vigor on the Woodbridge Road. Apparently Mr. Pratt had several times bought books from the professor, and the latter had promised to visit him again, so I felt in duty bound to oblige a good customer. After the varied adventures of the last 2 days, it was almost a relief to be alone to think things over. Here I was, Helen McGill, in a queer case indeed. Instead of being home at Sabine Farm getting supper, I was trundling along a strange road, the sole owner of Parnassus, probably the only one in existence, a horse and a dog, and a cartload of books on my hands. Since the morning of the day before, my whole life had twisted out of its accustomed orbit. I had spent $400 of my savings. I had sold about $13 worth of books. I had precipitated a fight and met a philosopher. Not only that, I was dimly beginning to evolve a new philosophy of my own. And all this in order to prevent Andrew from buying a lot more books. At any rate, I had been successful in that. When he had seen Parnassus at last, he had hardly looked at her, except in tones of scorn. I caught myself wondering whether the professor would allude to the incident in his book, and hoping that he would send me a copy. But after all, why should he mention it? To him, it was only one of 1,000 adventures. As he had said angrily to Andrew, he was nothing to me, nor I to him. How could he realize that this was the first adventure I had had in 15 years? I had been, what was it he called it? Compiling my anthology. Well, the funny little ginger snap. I kept Bach tied to the back of the van as I was afraid he might take a notion to go in search of his master. As we jogged on, and the falling sun cast a level light across the way, I got a bit lonely. This solitary vagabonding business was a bit sudden after 15 years of home life. The road lay close to the water, and I watched the sound grow a deeper blue and then a dull purple. I could hear the surf pounding, and on the end of Long Island, a faraway lighthouse showed a ruby spark. I thought of the little ginger snap roaring toward New York on the express, and wondered whether he was traveling in a Pullman or a day coach. A Pullman chair would feel easy after that hard Parnassus seat. By and by, we neared a farmhouse, which I took to be Mr. Pratt's. It stood close to the road with a big red barn behind and a gilt weather vane representing a galloping horse. Curiously enough, Peg seemed to recognize the place, for she turned into the gate and neighed vigorously. It must have been a favorite stopping place for the professor. Through a lighted window, I could see people sitting around a table. Evidently, the Pratts were at supper. I drew up in the yard. Someone looked out the window, and I heard a girl's voice. "Why, Pa, here's Parnassus." Ginger Snap must have been a welcome visitor at the farm. For an instant, the whole family turned out with a great scraping of chairs and clatter of dishes. A tall, sunburnt man in a clean shirt with no collar led the group. Then came a stout woman about my own build, and a hired man and three children. "Good evening," I said. "Is this Mr. Pratt?" "Sure thing," said he. "Where's the professor?" "On his way to Brooklyn," said I, "and I've got Parnassus. He told me to be sure to call on you, so here we are." "Well, I want to know," ejaculated Mrs. Pratt. "Think of Parnassus turned suffrage. Ben, you put up the critters, and I'll take Mrs. Mifflin in to supper." "Hold on there," I said. "My name's McGill, Miss McGill. See, it's painted on the wagon. I bought the outfit from Mr. Mifflin. A business proposition entirely." "Well, well," said Mr. Pratt. "We're glad to see any friend of the professor. Sorry he's not here, too. Come right in and have a bite with us." They were certainly good-hearted folk, Mr. and Mrs. Ben Pratt. He put Peg and Bach away in the barn and gave them their supper, while Mrs. Pratt took me up to her spare bedroom and brought me a jug of hot water. Then they all trooped back into the dining room, and the meal began again. I am a connoisseur of farm cooking, I guess, and I got to hand it to Beulah Pratt that she was an A1 housewife. Her hot biscuit was perfect. The coffee was real mocha, simmered, not boiled. The cold sausage and potato salad was as good as any Andrew ever got. And she had a smoking hot omelet sent in for me and opened a pot of her own strawberry preserve. The children, 2 boys and a girl, sat open-mouthed, nudging one another. And Mr. Pratt got out his pipe, and while I finished up on stewed pears and cream and chocolate cake. It was a regular meal. I wondered what Andrew was eating and whether he had found the nest behind the woodpile where the red hen always drops her eggs. "Well, well," said Mr. Pratt. "Tell us about the professor. We was expecting him here sometime this fall. He generally gets here around cider time." "I guess there isn't so much to tell," I said. "He stopped up at our place the other day and said he wanted to sell his outfit, so I bought him out. He was pining to get back to Brooklyn and write a book." "That book of his," said Mrs. Pratt. "He was always talking on it, but I don't believe he ever started it yet." "Whereabout do you come from, Miss McGill?" said Pratt. I could see he was mightily puzzled at a woman driving a vanload of books around the country alone. "Over toward Redfield," I said. You any kin to that writer that lives up there? You mean Andrew McGill? I said. He's my brother. Do tell, exclaimed Mrs. Pratt. Why, the professor thought a terrible lot of him. He read us all to sleep with one of his books one night. Said he was the best literature in this state. I do believe. I smiled to myself as I thought of the set to on the road from Shelby. Well, said Pratt, if the professor's got any better friends than us in these parts, I'm glad to meet him. He come here first time about 4 years ago. I was up working in the hayfield that afternoon, and I heard a shout down by the mill pond. I looked over that way and saw a couple of kids waving their arms and screaming. I ran down the hill, and there was the professor just pulling my boy Dick out of the water. Dick's this one over here. Dick, a small boy of 13 or so, grew red under his freckles. The kids had been fooling around on a raft there, and first thing you know, Dick fell in, right into deep water over by the dam. Couldn't swim a stroke neither. And the professor, who just happened to be coming along in that bus of his, heard the boys yell. Didn't he hop out of the wagon as spry as a chimpanzee, skin over the fence and jump into the pond, swim out there and tow the boy in. Yes, ma'am, he saved that boy's life then, and no mistake. That man can read me to sleep with poetry any night he has a mind to. He's a plumb fine little firecracker, the professor. Farmer Pratt pulled hard on his pipe. Evidently his friendship for the wandering bookseller was one of the realities of his life. Yes, ma'am, he went on, that professor had been a good friend to me, sure enough. We brought him and the boy back to the house. The boy had gone down 3 times, and the professor had to drive to find him. They were both pretty well all in, and I tell you, I was scared, but we got Dick around somehow, rolled him on a sugar barrel and poured whiskey in him, and worked his arms and put him in hot blankets. By and by he come to, and then I found that the professor, getting over the barbed wire fence so quick, when he lit for the pond, had torn a hole in his leg you could put 4 fingers in. There was his trouser all stiff with blood, and he not saying a thing. Pluckiest little runt in 3 states, by Judas. Well, we put him in the bed too, and then the missus keeled over and we put her to bed. 3 of them by the time the doc got here. Great old summer afternoon that was. But bless your heart, we couldn't keep the professor Abe for long. Next day he was out looking for his poetry books, and first thing you know, he was all rounded up and was preaching good literature at us like an evangelist. I guess we all fell asleep over his poetry, so then we started on reading that Treasure Island story to us. Wasn't it, Mother? By hickory, we none of us fell asleep over that. We started the kids reading, so they've been at it ever since. And Dick's top boy at school now. Teacher says she never saw such a boy for reading. That's what Professor done for us. Well, tell us about yourself, Miss McGill. Is there any good books we ought to read? I used to pine for some of that feller Shakespeare my father used to talk about so much, but Professor always lowed it was over my head. It gave me quite a thrill to hear all this about Mifflin. I could readily imagine the masterful little man captivating the simple-hearted Pratts with his eloquence and earnestness. And the story of the mill pond had its meaning, too. Little Redbeard was no more wandering crank. He was a real man, cool and steady of brain, with the earmarks of a hero. I felt a sudden gush of warmth as I recalled his comical ways. Mrs. Pratt lit a fire in her Franklin stove, and I racked my head, wondering how I could tread worthily in the professor's footsteps. Finally, I fetched the Jungle Book from Parnassus and read them the story of Rikki Tikki Tavi. There was a long pause when I had finished. Say, Pa, said Dick shyly, that mongoose was rather like the professor, wasn't he? Plainly, the professor was the traditional hero of this family, and I began to feel rather like an imposter. I suppose it was foolish of me, but I had already made up my mind to push on to Woodbridge that night. It could not be more than 4 miles, and the time was not much after 8. I felt a little twinge of quite unworthy annoyance because I was still treading in the glamour of the professor's influence. The Pratts would talk of nothing else, and I wanted to get somewhere where I would be estimated of my own value, not merely as his disciple. Darn the Redbeard, I said to myself, I think he has bewitched these people. And in spite of their protests and invitations to stay the night, I insisted on having Peg hitched up. I gave them a copy of the Jungle Book as a small return of their hospitality, and finally sold Mr. Pratt a little copy of Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, which I thought he could read without brain fever. Then I lit my lantern, and after a chorus of goodbye, Parnassus rolled away. Well, I said to myself as I turned into the high road once more, drat the ginger snap, he seems to hypnotize everybody. He must be nearly in Brooklyn by this time. It was very quiet along the road, also very dark, for the sky had clouded over and I could see neither moon nor stars. As it was a direct road, I should have no difficulty, and I suppose I must have fallen into a doze during which Peg took a wrong turning. At any rate, I realized about 9:30 that Parnassus was on a much rougher road than the highway had any right to be, and there were no telephone poles to be seen. I knew that they stretched all along the main road, so plainly I had made a mistake. I was reluctant for a moment to admit that I could be wrong, and just then Peg stumbled heavily and stood still. She paid no heed to my exhortations, and when I got out and carried my lantern to see whether anything was in the way, I found that she had cast a shoe and her foot was bleeding. The shoe must have dropped off some way back, and she had picked up a nail or something in the quick. I saw no alternative but to stay where I was for the night. This was not very pleasant, but the adventures of the day had put me into a stoical frame of mind, and I saw no good in repining. I unhitched Peg, sponged her foot, and tied her to a tree. I would have made more careful explorations to determine just where I was, but a sharp patter of rain began to fall. So I climbed into my Parnassus, took Bach in with me, and lit the swinging lamp. By this time it was nearly 10 o'clock. There was nothing to do but turn in, so I took off my boots and lay down in the bunk. Bach lay quite comfortably on the floor of the van. I meant to read for a while, and so did not turn out the light, but I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up at 11:30 and turned out the lamp, which had made the van very warm. I opened the little windows front and back and would have opened the door, but I feared Bach might slip away. It was still raining a little. To my annoyance, I felt very wakeful. I lay for some time listening to the patter of raindrops on the roof and skylight, a very snug sound when one is warm and safe. Every now and then I could hear Peg snapping in the underbrush. I was almost dozing off when Bach gave a low growl. No woman of my bulk has a right to be nervous, I guess, but instantly my security vanished. The patter of the rain seemed menacing, and I imagined 100 horrors. I was totally alone and unarmed, and Bach was not a large dog. He growled again, and I felt worse than before. I imagined that I heard stealthy sounds in the bushes, and once Peg snorted as though frightened. I put my hand down to pat Bach and found that his neck was all bristly, like a fighting cock. He uttered a queer half-growl, half-whine, which gave me a chill. Someone must be prowling around the van, but in the falling rain I could hear nothing. I felt I must do something. I was afraid to call out lest I betray the fact that there was only a woman in the van. My expedient was absurd enough, but at any rate it satisfied my desire to act. I seized one of my boots and banged vigorously on the floor, at the same time growling in as deep and masculine a voice as I could muster. "What the hell's the matter? What the hell's the matter?" This sounds silly enough, I dare say, but it afforded me some relief, and as Bach shortly ceased growling, it apparently served some purpose. I lay awake for a long time, tingling all over with nervousness. Then I began to grow calmer, and was getting drowsy almost in spite of myself, when I was aroused by the unmistakable sound of Bach's tail thumping on the floor. A sure sign of pleasure. This puzzled me quite as much as his growls. I did not dare strike a light, but I could hear him sniffing at the door of the van and whining with eagerness. This seemed very uncanny, and again I crept stealthily out of the bunk and pounded on the floor lustily, this time with the frying pan, which made an unearthly din. Peg neighed and snorted, and Bach began to bark. Even in my anxiety, I almost laughed. It sounds like an insane asylum, I thought. I reflected that probably the disturbance was only caused by some small animal, perhaps a rabbit or a skunk, which Bach had winded and wanted to chase. I patted him and crawled into my bunk once more. But my real excitement was still to come. About half an hour later, I heard unmistakable footsteps alongside the van. Bach growled furiously, and I lay in panic. Something jarred one of the wheels. Then broke out a most extraordinary racket. I heard quick steps. Peg whinnied, and something fell heavily against the back of the wagon. There was a violent scuffle on the ground, the sound of blows and rapid breathing. With my heart jumping, I peered out of one of the back windows. There was barely any light, but dimly I could see a tumbling mass which squirmed and writhed on the ground. Something struck one of the rear wheels so that Parnassus trembled. I heard hoarse swearing. Then the whole body, whatever it was, rolled off into the underbrush. There was a terrific crashing and snapping of twigs. Bach whined, growled, and pawed madly at the door, and then complete silence. My nerves were quite shattered by this time. I don't think I had been so frightened since childhood days when I awakened from a nightmare. Little trickles of fear crept up and down my spine and my scalp prickled. I pulled Bach on the bunk and lay with one hand on his collar. He, too, seemed agitated and sniffed gingerly now and then. Finally, however, he gave a sigh and fell asleep. I judged it might have been 2 o'clock, but I did not like to strike a light, and at last I fell into a doze. When I woke, the sun was shining brilliantly, and the air was full of the chirping of birds. I felt stiff and uneasy from sleeping in my clothes, and my foot was numb from Bach's weight. I got up, looked out of the window. Parnassus was standing in a narrow lane by a grove of birch trees. The ground was muddy and smeared with footprints behind the van. I opened the door and looked around. The first thing I saw on the ground was one of the wheels. By one of the wheels was a battered tweed cap. The end of chapter 8. We're going to leave it there for this time. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you later.